Buy land. They're not making any more of it. The hoary old investment cliche sums up attitudes to the world's oldest and most enduring asset. Over the centuries, big questions about land. Who owns it? Who gets to keep it? Whether and how it's taxed have been the subject of long-running and unresolved debates. Much of the time, social upheaval, geopolitical changes, and excitement about new technologies have obscured these fundamental issues. But every now and then, they rear up again. We're in such a period now. In developed countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, property owners and their descendants are enjoying the windfall from rising values. Meanwhile, other citizens are grappling with the cost of renting or trying to scrape together enough money to get a foothold on the housing ladder. Governments appear unable to build enough new housing to meet demand. Activists and some politicians are making the case for governments regulating rents or levying extra taxes on the wealthiest homeowners. At the same time, even as the stock market fizzes with excitement about artificial intelligence, real estate remains by far the biggest pillar supporting the financial system, with trillions of dollars of debt secured by the value of land and the structures built on it. And while money managers debate whether we're in an AI bubble, it's worth remembering that most of the biggest investment manias in modern history have been inflated by, and ultimately undone by, the changing value of property. So this week on The Big View, we're going to talk about the enduring question of land. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest questions in finance, business, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thal Larsen. To talk all this over, I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Bird. Mike is the Wall Street editor at The Economist, has previously worked as a journalist in Singapore, Hong Kong, and London, giving him valuable first-hand experience of some of the world's most expensive real estate markets. He's the author of a new book, The Land Trap, A New History of the World's Oldest Asset. And he joins me today from New York. Mike Bird, welcome to The Big View.
Peter, thank you very much for having me.
It's good to see you. So I'd like to start just with the title that you chose for the book, The Land Trap. What exactly is the trap?
So in the most simple terms, the land trap is something that countries get into when land is a very large proportion of national wealth, when it's a very important asset as far as national wealth goes. And that means that it's very, very difficult for prices to go up or down, for land values to go up or down, without having really, really serious negative consequences. When land prices go up, that affects inequality, wealth inequality. You get a lot of unmerited wealth inequality. And because it's a sort of relatively zero-sum asset, once one person owns a piece of land, someone else can't own it. It's never totally widespread in terms of the sort of wealth distribution of land. When land prices go down, you can see that inequality sort of ameliorated temporarily. But what you often get is financial crises in the aftermath. Largely because land is such an important asset in finance. It's used so extensively all over the world as collateral, whether that's for commercial banks or in some cases for, fiscal policy. So that was essentially what I started with as the land trap. And I think as I expanded the book, it became clear that this is even more broadly true. Land is a very difficult thing to change your institutions relating to once they're set a certain way. It's so important, it's so valuable, it's so extensive that moving in any one direction, whether that's mid-20th century land reform or whether it's Chinese fiscal policy today, it becomes incredibly difficult to do that. So that's the nature of the trap.
I mean, we think about this as a modern issue, I think, a lot of the time, right? I guess imagine you've lived in London, Hong Kong, Singapore, now New York. I mean, you probably paid quite a lot of rent over the years. The most expensive cities, some of the most expensive cities in the world. But I think one of the things that struck me about your book is actually it's kind of an alternative way of looking at economic history. I mean, I imagine that once you start thinking about things in terms of land, you see it everywhere, do you?
Yes, that's one of the problems. Actually, you start to see it all over the place. You can't get it out of your head once you start it. And I think a few people have said that the book is more like a sort of history of the modern world told through this asset. And I think it does come up again and again, inevitably. What we think of when we talk about land, I think most of the time, is residential housing in the most popular cities in the world. So, as you know, I've done this sort of tour of living in all the places where I could possibly pay the most rent for some reason. And we think of the problem that people have with land as one to do with residential housing in those cities, really superstar cities, to use the phrase. That's a huge portion of it, and it's very important now. It's not the only thing that's ever been true as far as land goes. If you look at the history of the US in the 19th century, absolutely peppered with land-related financial crises. Sometimes that is urban land, sometimes it's agricultural land, sometimes it's the land in and around railway stations where there are particularly good routes. So yeah, there's a huge variety, and I think for the past 300 years especially, land has been growing in importance in finance. And so the current iteration, the way we think of it, NIMBYs and YIMBYs, high price to income ratios, difficulty of people getting on the housing ladder is just one version of, I think, a much, much longer lasting theme running through most of modern history.
Yeah, no, we'll get back to the finance definitely a bit later on, but that sort of going back a bit. I mean, I think that's one of the striking things is you sort of see these echoes of some of the debates that are taking place at the moment. And you sort of you tell a big chunk of this story through this 19th century American economist called Henry George, who's kind of largely forgotten now, I think. What's so interesting about him? What sort of drew you to that?
Sure. So Henry George, fascinating figure, and I think especially fascinating for the fact that for a period in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Henry George was one of the most influential intellectual thinkers in the world. There's an often sort of trotted out statistic that the Progress and Poverty, his book on land, sold more copies in the late 19th century than any book other than the Bible. There's no, bestseller list that we can confirm that with, but it's extremely believable. Henry George was a journalist and author, and he basically developed a thesis that land, and particularly monopolies in land, were causing all of the social distress in the late 19th century. So you had this time of enormous technological progress. You had, industrial lighting. You had medical improvements. You had the advance of the railroad. You had the beginning of the, automobile. All sorts of things happening all at the same time. At the same time as that, you have all of this sort of grinding urban poverty, especially in America. That seems to be worse in the late 19th century than it had maybe been in the very early 19th century or the late 18th century. Henry George comes out with this book. The book slowly sort of accumulates followers, and it becomes enormously influential. He runs for mayor of New York. He's an international celebrity figure, really. He informs politics in the UK, in Europe, in Australia. And then within about sort of 20 years of his peak, he dies in 1897. Georgism, as people referred to it, the idea that you can tax away these monopolized land values and reap the benefit for the public, is basically dead as a social movement. It's effectively gone. And by the middle of the 20th century, certainly, it's completely evaporated. Someone calling themselves a Georgist is utterly meaningless to most people. It exists as a sort of residue in a number of different left-wing, mostly centrist, centre-right movements. But you don't get many people calling themselves Georgists. This is, a huge change in history. The Russian Revolution changes things enormously, the rise of international communism. But George was this sort of fascinating figure, and I think it's great to tell the book a little bit through that perspective, partly because people don't know it, and partly because I think the dynamics that led to his rise bear some similarities to the way the world is today.
So, and just I'd be interested to get onto that question of why why this sort of went away as an issue. But what was he advocating? What was his sort of main sort of policy proposal?
So his proposal was for 100% tax on the rental value of land. So basically, any rental income that was made through land should be taxed, not just at a punitive rate, but that none of that income should go to the landlord. It should entirely be the property of the public. And he was actually relatively, I would say, libertarian. Other than that, people talked at the time about the single tax,
Right.
because it was just that he was a sort of ardent anti-protectionist. Didn't see the role for other taxes, despite the fact that he got a lot of support during his lifetime from organized labor. Wasn't really much of an organized labor guy at all. So he had this sort of the one big idea that would fix everything, which was completely destroying land rents. This was the thesis, and this is what he pushed, and it gains enormous popularity. I think partly the American frontier is closing at this period, right? So the sort of American dream, people moving westward, seems to be ending for a lot of people, right? They no longer can just turn up somewhere and say, this is mine. And in Europe, it's incredibly popular because you still have, at this point, extraordinarily concentrated land ownership. Most British land is still owned by aristocrats from families that have owned it for hundreds of years. So yeah, enormous appeal to this. It's a very sort of one big idea kind of thesis, and it became enormously popular.
And then it goes away. And I guess, you talked about the Russian Revolution. I guess part of it is just, there was an even more radical idea, which was called socialism, which was like, none of this belongs to or this belongs to everyone, and none of it belongs to anybody. So that presumably sort of is what also, I guess, has an appeal to people who were attracted by this kind of idea. But there are other things going on as well, right? You have sort of innovation in agriculture, which meant that it became much more efficient. So sort of the kind of land issue sort of fades for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. It waxes and wanes. You had the Russian Revolution, which really changed things. You had one organized international left. Marxism doesn't really have a central role for land. Land is another form of capital. At the same time, on the right and in established economics, you also have groups of people who are removing land from the thesis, right? Classical economics. People sometimes refer to George as the last classical economist. If you go back to Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, there's a role for land separate to capital. People talk about it in a very separate way. Modern economics doesn't really have a role for land, and certainly at that point you have people like Marshall coming up and really modernizing and sort of instituting modern economics as a discipline and removing land as having a specific role from their thinking. People on the right start pursuing mass home ownership as a sort of tool to fight the left. Again, to some extent, it aligns with George's views in the sense that mass home ownership, at least at first, allows a much bigger group of people to share in land wealth, right? But it also creates what are essentially the problems that we see today, right? Small monopolies in land, not enormous agricultural estates, but small ones. Now, through the process of the 20th century, mass home ownership starts to kill off Georgist ideas. It just doesn't have the same appeal that it had before. You've got fewer tenants, less natural appeal. In the developing world, you see a lot of, I would say, close cousin Georgist movements. They're not usually explicitly informed by Georgism, but land reform movements in the middle of the 20th century, which basically push for mass land redistribution, right, from large landlords, absentee landlords, to their tenants. This has some enormous successes in a small part of East Asia. Well, not small, but part of East Asia. You see Japan, you see South Korea, you see Taiwan, all in this sort of fairly narrow political window getting serious land reform done. And it kind of flounders in most of the rest of Asia and most of the rest of the world. You don't see massive changes in most of the landowning institutions. And a big reason for that, as you alluded to, is agricultural technology. So the advent of the Green Revolution, of far better crops, far better weather-resistant and blight-resistant crops, cause this spike in agricultural yields, and suddenly it feels like the priority in terms of redistributing it, which is very politically difficult, is no longer where it was. So you see this enormous change, and land does, I think, through history, sort of wax and wane. You also see things like in America, the change in transport technology changes things, right? Henry George ran for mayor in 1886 in New York. Most people lived in Manhattan, right? And most people lived in Lower Manhattan, and it was crowded and horrible. And then in the very early 20th century, especially in the 1920s, the subway rolls out. And suddenly you can live in the Bronx, you can live in Queens, you can live in South Brooklyn and go and work in Manhattan, right? Which means you can own a home, you can have a bit more space, and the natural appeal of this land-related politics ebbs, and you see the importance of land ebb as well. It's now back again because we've got nothing quite so important as the subway, improving the distance from which we can travel to work. But it does, it waxes and wanes.
But just want to talk about the East Asia examples that you talked about, because I mean, those are situations where there was really quite significant, quite brutal in some ways redistribution of land. Obviously, in the context of Japan after World War II, South Korea, having had or Korea having had a civil war and then a separation, Taiwan, where obviously the exiled Chinese government showed up and sort of reorganized things. I mean, it seems like things have to be quite. There has to be quite a sort of big rupture in terms of a country's history to enable that kind of change.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the difficulties with stuff like land reform. Joe Studwell, who's an excellent author, wrote a book called How Asia Works, and he talks about sort of 3 conditions for which you can have sort of rapid Asian development. And the first one is land reform. And it's no surprise to him that the countries that got land reform right are the ones that also developed much more rapidly than countries in Southeast and South Asia, which are much more slow in doing so. But it is incredibly narrow in terms of the circumstances. Basically, in 1945, Wolf Ladyszyński, who I spend a bit of time on in the book, Mr. Land Reform, one of the most successful and prominent advocates of land reform. He works in the US Department of Agriculture. He's a refugee from Ukraine who fled during the Russian Revolution, and he promotes land reform as an anti-communist measure, right? He basically says the communists are going to offer the peasantry in the countryside the land, and if you don't do the same, they'll listen to the communists. Now, in South Korea and Taiwan in the late 1940s, this is an extremely appealing message, right? The threat of communism is not abstract in these places. It's right next door. It's extremely immediate. And even big landlords who might previously have made a huge fuss about all of this, and some of them did, can sort of understand that the writing is on the wall, right? Their best next alternative, being run by a communist government, does not look too good to them. So you have these political circumstances. In Japan, even more so, in that Douglas MacArthur essentially wields the power of an emperor in Japan. More authority, I think, than any American has ever wielded anywhere, really. Not bound by the normal things that the US president would be bound by. Wolf Ladyszyński convinces him of the importance of land reform. He's just able to tell the Japanese government to do it, right? The ordinary political constraints in the Japanese government prior to World War II actually, considered sorts of land reform and basically said no, too ambitious, too difficult. So the narrow political circumstances are enormously important. I think they go a long way to explain why it didn't happen elsewhere, because where you didn't have either the combination of, it's the US commander's decision what happens, or immediate external threat, you didn't see these things come through. Even in South Vietnam, which did have the immediate external threat, they still stumbled over land reform for years and tried to implement it right at the end, when it was far too late. So it's extremely difficult to do. I think that's one of the main things that comes through, hopefully, in the book.
Yeah, no, very much so. Just a sort of a follow-up on Japan, because obviously Japan is then 50 years later is the scene of the of probably the most intense property-based, kind of investment bubble that we've ever seen in terms of prices going up and then crashing and causing a sort of a multi-decade kind of hangover. Is the reform, does that enable that bubble in some way, do you think, or do you think those two things are kind of completely different?
It's not got zero connection. So you do see a lot of people in the 1960s and the 1970s in Japan starting to sell those small holdings to corporations, right? Not the deep agricultural small holdings, but anything that's relatively near a city. I would say the main point is actually, how Asia works, the second step that Joe Stubble identifies in East Asian development, I think this is where we would, maybe start to disagree on things, is financial repression, right? Which is, I think, the core of what happened and what went wrong in Japan, which is that, essentially, put simply, financial repression means trying to direct low interest rate credit towards your favored companies, whether that's exporters or domestic investment or whatever it is. To do this in a really fast growing country like Japan, you need to redirect people's savings into the preferred investment. Basically, you need them to be leaving their money in banks at relatively low interest rates. So there's some sort of funding stream for these corporates. If you're in a country like Japan, and Japan is growing for large parts of the 50s and 60s, averaging out at double-digit rates, right? Extraordinarily fast growth. And you're getting 3%, 4% from a bank deposit, maybe even less. This is not that impressive, right? Land is a really great way of accessing that growth, right? If you're buying land in Tokyo or whatever, it enables, because it's the value of the land is informed by the economic activity around it, it's your sort of last possibility to access the growth happening around you when nothing else is really permitted. I think that's the biggest part to me of what happened in Japan. It contributed to what's called the land myth in Japan, the idea that land prices would never fall, which is extraordinarily strongly believed basically from the middle of the 1950s, say, until 1989, 1990, when everything goes sour. And if you believe in that, then there's no limit to how much land you should be buying. You should be driving all of your money into land. You should be borrowing to invest in land, because if the government won't let the prices go down, you've got essentially a sort of permanent backstop. They can only go up. Why not? And this is the seeds of the sort of the problem that subsequently happened.
Well, yes, and we've seen it subsequently in other places as well. It's always a sign of trouble, that. And which sort of brings us to the financial industry, which is sort of another big part of what you're writing about, which is that this real estate sort of underpins this financial industry. And I guess what I'm curious for your thoughts on is there seems to be a paradox here, because if you think about the way developed economies have moved, more and more value, it seems, is being created out of thin air. It's intellectual property or corporate brands or lines of code. Some of the world's biggest and most successful tech companies have gone to great lengths to make sure that they have as few as possible sort of hard assets on their balance sheets. They outsource the manufacturing and all this sort of stuff. And yet property and land becomes an ever bigger part of the financial system. How do you explain that?
I think probably the best way to explain it sounds like these two things are clashing against each other. I increasingly think they're sort of two sides of the same coin, right? Ask a small business owner or entrepreneur to go into a bank and explain, I've actually got this great piece of intangible capital for you. I've got this wonderful idea. I've got a great network effect. Even a great piece of software, and I'd like you to extend me a loan against it, right? And they will tell you how long that meeting will last, right? This is not something that bankers are particularly well equipped to do. It's great if you're in venture capital. It's great in some parts of private markets in the US, and for really big companies, you can access, streams of lending against your future cash flows, against your receivables, which sometimes goes wrong as well, but you can access these sorts of things. at the lowest end, you're simply not going to be able to find any money for these things. And so I think actually the rise of sort of intangible and digital and non-corporeal capital makes the role of land in finance more rather than less important. And you've seen, especially in the banking system over time, this was a long-term trend even before 2008, but you've seen the sort of increasingly conservative banking behavior since 2008. Real estate and residential housing in particular is by far the safest form of lending that they can do, right? That's not just in terms of how they think of it, but it's in terms of the regulatory treatment as well, which is extraordinarily, lenient. And there's this sort of active discussion of how much some of the Basel regulation leading up to the financial crisis might have encouraged people into mortgage lending and mortgage-backed securities. I don't come on down, hard in the book as to whether that's the case, but I think basically you've seen the banking system become increasingly mortgage-oriented. I think one of the statistics I have in the book, UK banks in the early 20th century, before World War One, had a single-digit percentage allocation to mortgage lending, right? Secured against housing. And that makes sense in a world where a very, very small portion of people actually own their own homes, right? This isn't an ordinary form of lending. It's not an everyday thing. And now, we're talking about by far the majority, right? We're talking about 60, 70%, some places even higher, allocated to mortgages. So over the 20th century, banking changes completely, and it becomes a completely mortgage-dominated business. I think that fits actually, as I say, quite well with the intangible side of things, because intangibles are so heterogeneous, they're so difficult to value. Some economics literature that refers to this as lazy banking. I don't think I refer to it that way in the book. I don't want to be rude about my friends in the banking industry, but collateral's a really good thing to lend against, and land and real estate just easier to value. You can't run away with them. It's a really useful asset for the real estate for the financial industry.
Doesn't depreciate, unlike AI chips or something like that.
Indeed. Yeah. And that's actually one of the things I feel like people people basically know that you can't make more land or move it around. I think they understand this when you talk to them about it. But the fact that land doesn't depreciate when you're thinking of lending against it, why not lend forever? The land will still be there. Yeah, it might go up or down in value, but it literally doesn't decay. It doesn't rot. The wealthiest fortunes in London are still based on people whose ancestors made the correct decision and bought land in London in, the 16th century, 17th century, when it was a little bit cheaper than it is now. Some of the very rich people in the UK based on that, and it's because it doesn't depreciate.
Yeah, it reminds me of the I think it was the Duke of Westminster who was asked about the secret of his success, and he said, "Have an ancestor who came over with William the Conqueror." That's kind of right. I want to go back to where we started with this sort of, this deep public unhappiness now about the distribution of real estate and land. And towards the end of the book, you say the politics of land in the 21st century will be much more complicated than it was at the end of the 19th century. What do you mean by that?
Well, at the end of the 19th century, especially in Europe, it was a little bit different in the US because you always had larger land-owning proportion in the US. But at the end of the 19th century in the UK, for example, this was just a clean hit for a liberal or progressive politician. Almost nobody owned significant amounts of land, right? Especially increasingly valuable urban land. It was just extraordinarily rare. And you could appeal to a very, very large proportion of the electorate by pointing at the small portion and saying, those guys are the problem, right? The reason it's much more complicated now is that you cannot do that anymore. There are a number of interesting things going on in terms of, the value of housing in superstar cities has gone up very sharply relative to middling and sort of down on their luck cities. That's true. But in most parts of the Western world, you are looking at societies where either a majority or a very, very large plurality of people owns their own homes, right? They're owner occupied. And so the Henry George solution, we're actually going to quite aggressively tax you to try and get you to build up or move out or to try and spread the benefits of this elsewhere, is simply not going to fly. It's immediately off-putting to a very large proportion of people. So the politics will be, I think, much more difficult, much more dangerous. At the same time, you are heading into a world where it's extraordinarily difficult to become a first-time buyer. I've written something recently about the drying up of mortgage lending in general in the US. The mortgage market as a whole is the same size relative to the value of the housing stock in the US as it was 60 years ago, right? It's at a 60-year low.
Wow.
What you're going to see through this is your ability to own a home is going to matter much more on the question of whether your parents own a home or whether you'll inherit it, right? That's going to be the first thing that is going to inform whether you own a home in the future as a young person. I think the politics of that become very difficult, very dangerous as well. You don't want to live in a society where everything is put down to inheritance and you're taking away the sort of merit-led aspect of it. So but the politics will be very different to the late 19th century simply because, the urban structure, the ownership of land is so different now.
But you're sort of seeing signs of that, aren't you? I mean, in the UK, we'll see what happens, but there's sort of speculation that the government might tax more expensive houses. I mean, you live in New York. Zoran Mamdani got elected as mayor of New York in part by promising to freeze rent in rent-controlled apartments, which, I mean, that's a whole other question. But there is sort of, people are sort of trying to tap into this unhappiness about the cost of housing, basically.
Definitely. And I think in multiple different ways. I mean, in the US, the fascinating element is that you're getting these from both ends. So you see urban, mostly Democrat-run cities having rent freeze and sort of pro-renter policies, whether it's rent control or freezes or whatever, that are pretty bad, I would say, in the long term for the supply of housing, because if landlords can't make a return, they don't invest, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. But you're also seeing it from the flip side, which is that in a lot of red states, you have these property tax revolts, right? People pushing back against America's system of relatively high property taxation, which is in itself a relic of the fact that in the early 20th century, lots of fans of Henry George found themselves in municipal government in the US and used the property tax as their main tool of raising money. There's huge revolts against that. And it's because property prices have gone up so much in the past few years that a lot of people have seen their tax bill go up and up and up, outstripping their income by a considerable degree. So you're seeing revolts from both ends, whether it's from renters or owners. The politics of this seems to be coming back in a big way. And you definitely see it in places like the UK, where, again, the total amount of land wealth has really gone up very, very significantly in the last 20 years or so, way, way outstripping the rise in income. So when you have a government that is sort of desperately cash-strapped, it's a very obvious place to start looking. It is, occasionally like touching the third rail. You are going to seriously struggle, I think, to squeeze too much out of landowners. I do wonder whether it's something that might be easier to bring in the future. Sorry, not in the future so much as staggered through time. I've seen some interesting proposals about things like if you stopped people in the UK, if you gave them an exemption from paying stamp duty, and in exchange they agreed to a steadily higher tax on the value of the land under their home over time, that might be a good way of sort of grandfathering in a land value tax, not a steep one like Henry George wanted, but something much more modest. I think we could see something like that, but it's understandable why you have governments like the UK government looking so much at the idea of taxing this, because it looks like a lot of money now relative to the other bases you could potentially tax.
Yeah, it does. Well, and whatever they come up with will be preferable to losing a world war and having Douglas MacArthur telling people what to do. So maybe that's the way to present it. We have to stop there, Mike. This has been really fascinating. So very much appreciate you taking the time, and thanks a lot.
No, thank you very much for having me.
That's our show this week. Thanks to Mike for that great conversation. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich with the help of Michael Coupland, John Hodge and Sunita Barforth in the studio in London. You can check out a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday. Don't forget to tune in to our sister show Viewsroom every Thursday, as well as all the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions and ideas, please email us on breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you liked what you heard, please rate the show and leave us a review. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.